Don't be feeling blue, no, no. Shine your light all around, like I know you can do, baby. Yeah, I know you can do. Now some people.
Hello, friends. This is Mike Williams of the Sage of Quay Radio Hour. I recently had the pleasure of joining host Derek Hess on his radio show Overrated on 89.3 WCSB out of Cleveland, Ohio. Derek asked if I could talk to his audience about the Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas E.U. Harriot. For those that don't know, Memoirs is a book written in the first person by an individual named William or Bill Shepherd, who claims to be the man who has been playing the part of Paul McCartney for 50 years, after the real Paul passed away on September 11, 1966. As I've stated in other shows where I've talked about the book, I am not affiliated with Thomas E.U. Harriot, Bill Shepherd, or Shepherd as Paul McCartney, and have no financial association whatsoever with the book. My discussions regarding the Memoirs of Billy Shears is motivated simply by my interest in the Paul is dead topic. The discussion with Derek was free-flowing, and we even venture into some philosophical dialogue about the afterlife. And with that, I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hey, this is Derek Hess. You're listening to Overrated. I have Mike Williams on the phone, and how are you doing, Mike? It's been a little while since I spoke to you.
I'm doing well, Derek, and thank you for having me back on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure, too. You always have something good to say, and today, getting right into it, you're going to have some stuff to say about Paul McCartney.
I am talking about the rumor that Paul McCartney died back in 1966, and, that rumor crops up every once in a while, then it fades away, and it really has come back now with a fervor. So that's what we're going to discuss today, whether that rumor is true or not.
Yes, and you're going to leave that up to the listeners to decide. And 1966 is when Paul McCartney was supposedly he died in a car wreck.
That's correct. Yep. So there's a book that's out that has been out since 2009. The book is called The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And the author is a fellow by the name of Tom E.U. Harriot. But the interesting thing about the book is Tom is a ghostwriter. The book is actually written in first person, and the person that is speaking to the reader is a gentleman by the name of William Wallace Shepherd, or Bill Shepherd. And this person, Bill Shepherd, is telling us that he has been playing the character of Paul McCartney since September 1966. The biological Paul, the real Paul McCartney, died in a car crash, as you had mentioned, back on September 11th, 1966. And since then, for 50 years, we have been listening and watching Bill Shepherd playing the part of Paul McCartney.
Playing the part of Billy Shear.
Well, no, Billy Shears is an alias that was first introduced on the Sgt. Pepper album. Right. So Bill Shepherd is his real name. William Shepherd is his real name. He has a couple of aliases. He uses Billy Shears. He also goes by William or Bill Campbell. He was also Phil Ackrell of the Diplomats going back to the early 1960s, where he played with Denny Lane. So that relationship was resurrected when Shepherd decided to, when he went solo and decided to put Wings together, and he reunited with Denny Lane in the early 1970s. So the person that we're talking about, his real name is William Shepherd.
Okay, a.k.a. Billy Shepherd.
Right.
Now, in 66, which record is the backwards masking that says Paul is dead? Well, is that on the White record?
Yeah, the White Album. Most people are familiar with the song Revolution No. 9, where if you play the record backwards, it'll say "Turn Me On, Dead Man."
Okay.
But the actual clues started prior to Sgt. Pepper. The first album that Bill Shepherd played on as Paul McCartney was Sgt. Pepper. And Sgt. Pepper, of course, if you take a look at the album cover, it's a funeral scene. Prior to that, there was another album which introduced Bill Shepherd, and it's called A Collection of Oldies. And this is a very interesting Beatle album. It was released on December 10th, 1966. So that would have been 3 months after the biological Paul had passed away. And if anybody has access to that album or that CD, you could take a look at the front cover. The album is called Oldies and not Greatest Hits. So again, it was released in 1966, and this was the heyday of the Beatles, the height of their popularity in 1966. And the album is called A Collection of Beatles Oldies and not Greatest Hits. And what that album is signifying is a transition from phase one of the Beatles, which was biological Paul, the real Paul McCartney, to phase two, which was Bill Shepherd. And so that album cover has a psychedelic cover, which introduces the new era of Beatle music. So when Bill Shepherd took the helm, where the Beatles were going, they were going in a direction of psychedelic music and the psychedelic movement. So the album, a collection of oldies, actually kicks that off prior to Sgt. Pepper being released.
Is that when they discovered LSD and started working that into their compositions and their music?
Yeah, well, the thing with LSD is very interesting because, the Beatles started dabbling in drugs, but the person that was involved in the distribution of LSD, and this is based upon information in the book. Again, the book is called The Memoirs of Billy Shears by Thomas Hugh Harriott, is Bill Shepherd playing the part of Paul McCartney. And in the book, he states that he actually worked with British intelligence, the CIA, through the MK Ultra program, and he was behind the scenes in putting together the Monterey Pop Festival, the Summer of Love in 1967, and he was working with British intelligence and the CIA to distribute LSD. And what they were looking for was the social and societal effects of the young people once they were under the influence of LSD. So he played a part in that, and in the book, it seems like he played a rather big part because a lot of people don't know this, but that concert, the Monterey Pop Festival, that festival was pulled together. The main person behind the scenes pulling those artists together was Paul McCartney, but the person playing Paul McCartney was not biological Paul, it's Bill Shepherd.
Now, Paul, it's rumored to be that he started having dreams about his upcoming death.
That's right. So back in the 1965 timeframe, let's say, that Paul was having these nightmares, and he was having premonitions of his death, and it started to become very worrisome to him. And these dreams were very realistic; they were very vivid, and so he would tell the other Beatles about the fact that he was having these dreams, and of course they didn't take him very seriously. They just basically scoffed it off and told him, it's okay, they're just dreams. But while he was having these dreams, he was also having this desire to kind of get things ready for his demise. So in the book, Shepherd writes that biological Paul was actually looking to try to figure out who could replace him when the time came that he would have to be replaced because he was no longer with us. And I've been asked before, how do we know that Paul was doing this? And of course, it's coming from Bill Shepherd via the book. And Shepherd, of course, is getting this information from the other Beatles because one of the comments I make to folks, Derek, is that we were listening to the biological Paul, the real Paul McCartney, for only 2.5 years. For the last 50 years, the Paul McCartney that we have been listening to and watching and enjoying the music of has been Bill Shepherd. So Shepherd, he's had a lot of conversations with folks. He was, obviously he was in the Beatles, and he's very, very connected. And we can get into that perhaps a little later in the discussion also. He's a very, very high Freemason, and Freemasonry played a huge part in his placement into the Beatles.
Yes, let's get to that in a minute here. Now, the motive behind the imposter, Bill Shepherd, excuse me. Now, I listened to your other interview the other day on, I don't remember what the radio station was or the blog it was on. But one of the motives, which I found interesting, and I find it very credible knowing stuff about the music industry and working with it, is that Paul was one of the more popular of the Beatles, and the record labels were concerned that the sales would drop if Paul was no longer in the Beatles. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was one viewpoint, that the Beatles were so popular and they were driving so much cash for everybody that was involved, including the British government, by the way. But I think more importantly is that the Beatles, along with other bands coming out of the movement back in the 1960s, the British invasion, they were Tavistock projects. So the Tavistock Institute was behind the Beatles. They were also behind the Rolling Stones. In the book, Bill Shepherd makes it very clear that the Beatles were a Tavistock project. And I believe that it was an experiment to see, at the end of the day, whether a very, very high-profile entertainer musician could be replaced and essentially go unnoticed by the majority of the public.
So this was an experiment, but what were they going to do? I mean, we may never know, but what were they going to do if it failed and people figured it out at the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me just back up 1 second.
Sure.
And I want to make it clear that the actual replacement and seeing if the public would pick up on the replacement of McCartney, that was one aspect. The creation of the Beatles themselves and the whole rock movement going back to the British invasion in the 1960s was essentially social engineering. It was taking music to see where music could steer people. So they were trying to steer the social consciousness into directions. It could be any number of things that we realized back in the 1960s. It could be the drug movement. It could be free love. It could be any one of those things that Tavistock was interested in seeing what they can do via music. So
very quickly, Tavistock,
yeah, S-T-O-C-K, Tavistock.
What are they? Very quickly.
Tavistock Institute was formed in 1947, and it's called the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. That actually goes back to 1921. So today it's known as the Tavistock Institute, starting in 47. In 1921, they were called the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. But basically, what they're involved in, Derek, and what they have been involved in for a very long time, is mass brainwashing techniques. They are very interested in their ability to modify human behavior and human psychology. So they've used a lot of techniques. Think of it as mind manipulation, mind shaping, social engineering, and so on. This is what they do. Now, if you look them up on Wikipedia as an example, it won't say all this. It'll have this very generic, really nice picture of what Tavistock's involved in. But when you dig in under the covers and you get into the rabbit hole, what Tavistock is all about is mind control and social engineering. They were also behind the LSD counterculture in the 1960s, the student revolutions, and this was all financed by the CIA. So when we talk about Tavistock, Tavistock works with British intelligence, MI5, MI6. They work with the CIA, which is the equivalent of the British MI6, and so on. So basically what you have is Tavistock working with the intelligence organizations throughout the world, and they're very, very interested. One of their objectives is to be able to control the human mind. It's to be able to get people to have values that they want people to have thoughts that they want people to have. It's what's the old saying? Your thoughts are not your own. And this is where they go. They want you to believe that your thoughts are yours, but essentially what you're doing is many people are spewing back thoughts, ideas, values, social norms, as an example, that Tavistock and many of these organizations that work with Tavistock have created.
Today, more than ever, that could really apply with the social media and just the entertainment industry. It seems like that could really apply today. And they still have their fingers in it today?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point. So when you think about it, you say especially today, it's very true. We see it today. It's in your face. For those people that are awake, they see what's going on. They can see that there's manipulation going on, that there's steering going on. Now, when you think about it, Tavistock has been around since 1921. So we're talking about almost 100 years of, they're having their hands in the pot, doing this type of work and undertaking these types of endeavors. So the music scene, as an example, was just one of those tools that they used to be able to create that social engineering and that mind conditioning.
The LSD movement, like you've mentioned that you believe Tavistock was behind that. Well, why did that dissipate? Why did the LSD movement go away? Were they behind that as well, do you think, or did just the people get tired of it? First
of all, Tavistock wasn't the only ones that were behind it. I mean, the CIA obviously had a huge piece of this. So what I'm saying is they're all working together is what I'm saying. So it's kind of, it would be a flaw, I think, in the thinking if people really wanted to segment this up and say, well, these guys only do this. It's much more complicated than that. So we have this very broad approach where these these organizations work together and they tap into each other's resources and skills and ideas and initiatives and projects, and they kind of stitch it all together. So it's very complex. Now, I don't know why the LSD movement faded from the scene, to be honest with you. I've heard different types of ideas or thoughts, perspectives on why that could have happened. One of the perspectives that I have read, which makes some sense to me, is that it didn't go the way they wanted it to go. So in other words, what happened was when people were engaging in LSD, it was opening up their minds to a degree where they weren't really able to control these people. They weren't really able to control people that were experiencing, if you will, expanded consciousness. The same way if somebody were taking ayahuasca or peyote or those types of things there, DMT as an example, where you're having this very expanded consciousness experience. So it didn't go away, in essence. Today,
it just didn't go the way they wanted it.
It didn't go the way they wanted it to go. So I believe that it's possible, based upon the research I've done, that they pulled back from it. I don't think it's gone away completely. In fact, I was watching one video recently where it's been documented that many of the elites are microdosing LSD. In other words, they're not taking LSD in large quantities. They're microdosing it. And when they microdose on a very consistent basis, what they're finding is that they're able to tap into a broader knowledge base. They're able to tap into their expanded consciousness. They're able to just reach in, and they're able to experience knowledge and wisdom and ideas and thoughts and ingenuity and creativity that otherwise wouldn't be available to them. And I found that to be very interesting. In the video that I watched, and I'll send you a link to this video after the show if you'd like, they specifically mentioned those people that were involved in Silicon Valley, who were turning out all of our technology and stuff like that, that many of these people are involved in LSD microdosing. So my point being is it hasn't gone away. I think the initial experiment with it was like, well, this is not going exactly the way we thought it would, so let's kind of switch gears here and do something different.
Okay, yeah, and also, you said that many people have their fingers in this pie. And you mentioned Masons early on. Now, how does that factor in?
Well, the Freemasons, for those that don't know, the Masons are a secret society, and many people who do know about something about the Freemasons, they think in terms of those little lodges that you see in your town. And those little lodges, they essentially go to the first 3 degrees of Masonry. But when we talk about the real hidden or occulted Freemasonry, we're talking about the very, very high-level degrees, like 32nd degree, 33rd degree Masons. And in fact, in the book, Bill Shepard states that there are degrees above the 33rd degree of Masonry, and it was very interesting that he took the reader down that path. He himself, he readily admits in the book that he's a very high-level Mason, and the way that he got the position, the way he was placed in the position to replace the biological Paul McCartney was via his uncle, who at the time, back in 1966, was a very, very high Mason, and at the time a higher ranking degreed Mason than Bill Shepard at the time, because Shepard is 5 years older than the biological Paul, Derek. So when Paul McCartney died, he was 24 years old. So Shepard was pushing almost 30 when he replaced biological Paul. In fact, many people have called this out when they take a look at pictures of McCartney in 1965. This would be the biological Paul. And then they take a look at the guy that's Paul McCartney in 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper. Many people have looked at those pictures and said, that guy, he looks a lot older. He doesn't look like the kid anymore. So what happened between 65 and 66 and 1967? We know people, they change their appearance, they may get a little older looking, whatever, but not to the degree that people were picking up when they looked at McCartney in 65, 66, and then they looked at this guy, Bill Shepard, who was playing McCartney in 1967.
The earlobes are different.
Well, the earlobes are different, the chin was different, the nose was different. There were a lot of things. He's taller. He's significantly taller than the original Paul McCartney. The original Paul was not a very tall guy, but Shepard is a tall man. So there were a lot of physical differences that people looked past. I remember growing up. I wasn't a believer in this, by the way. Paul is dead. I had been looking at these clues since 1976, I want to say, when I was in high school. And I would page in and out taking a look because it would pop up every once in a while, and I would go back and take a look at it. And I would conclude that, well, you know what? I don't think this was possible because somebody would have said something. He's
Right.
working with all these other musicians. He's working with engineers. He's working with producers and so on. Somebody would have said something. And the truth of the matter is the reason why nobody said anything, and he talks about this in the book, is because the other bands like the Stones, The Who,
And the Who.
Elton
Right.
John, yes, Donovan especially. I mean, Shepard had a lot of conversations with Donovan when he first came on board, and also with Mick Jagger. They were all in the same program.
Was
So-
Bowie in it as well?
I don't know. I would say that the whole music industry, Derek, is controlled by the secret society. So David Bowie, in order for Bowie to get where he got, had to be part of the program also. Now, that doesn't mean that these guys are all evil. It just says that they are in secret societies. They are high-ranking Masons, most likely. We'll stick with the Freemasons for now.
Sure.
And so guys like Bowie, Mick Jagger, even John Lennon. In the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, there's a chapter where Shepard goes through an illustration that John Lennon did. It's all occulted. It's all esoteric. So Lennon had to have a very good understanding of the occult and the esoteric in order to create this picture that he did. In fact, I'll send you a picture of it after the show is over so you can take a look at it.
Sure.
All of these guys were into this. George Martin, who was the Beatle producer, is a high-level Freemason. In fact, he was knighted also. He's known as Sir, or was known. He's passed away, Sir George Martin. Bill Shepard, as Paul McCartney, was knighted twice.
Now, isn't today's Paul? Isn't he? Wasn't he knighted as well?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Today,
Okay.
Paul McCartney that we see today, that's Bill Shepard. He's been
Got it,
knighted
got
not
it.
just once. I thought it was once, and then on an interview I had with a friend of mine, Mark Devlin, Mark had said, Mike, he was knighted twice. So 2 times he's been to the Queen and he's been knighted. So you don't get knighted, you don't get the title of Sir unless you are in the ruling elite apparatus. It just does not happen, Derek. You and I will never be knighted no matter what it is that we do.
Yeah.
Never, okay? So when you get knighted and you become part of that very elite club, it's because you are doing what you're supposed to do in service of the secret society, in service to the Illuminati. So that's why they get knighted. So they get essentially rewarded for their efforts and their results. More importantly, their results.
Okay, yeah, got it. And you said that he was having many discussions with Mick Jagger and about this whole thing.
Yeah, he was having conversations with Jagger, and in the book he states that Jagger actually was very irritated by the whole thing because Jagger looked at it and was saying, hey, the rest of us had to really work at this. In other words, right? We had to write songs. We're out there breaking our asses, doing gigs, generating records in the recording studio and so on. And you come in and you just step into this very successful person's shoes and you're going to pick it up from here. So I think what they were looking for, I think Jagger especially was looking for, was for Bill Shepard to fall on his face. They were really hoping he would just, boom, face first into the floor. And when it didn't happen, and when Shepard was able to show that he was extremely, extremely skilled at being a musician, at being an entertainer, that their attitude started to change. In fact, in the book, he states that Elton John found out a little later because John Lennon had told him. And when Lennon had told Elton John that Shepard replaced biological Paul, Elton John wrote the song Gray Seal on the Yellow Brick Road album. And that song, Gray Seal, is a knock against Bill Shepard. It's a Paul is Dead song, okay? But later on, Shepard states that he and Elton John actually became very good friends. And again, it was because they had to come to the realization that regardless of what transpired with Bill Shepard replacing the biological Paul, that this guy still had an enormous amount of talent. And that everything from Sgt. Pepper on, we talk about Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, The White Album, Yellow Submarine, Abbey Road, Let It Be, all Bill Shepard. And in fact, Bill Shepard became the leader of the Beatles in 1966. And in order to do this, he had to have a meeting with Brian Epstein and John Lennon. Lennon was devastated by the death of Paul McCartney. And when Shepard was brought in to meet Lennon, Shepard had a list of demands because in his mind, he was saying, if I'm going to do this, it has to be worth my while, because he had to change his appearance. One of the things that took place was there was an enormous level of surgeries and injections in order to alter the facial appearance, the facial features of Bill Shepard, to transform him into looking more like Paul McCartney. And so he was essentially going to have a completely different life, a completely different persona. Now, his close friends and inner circle, they knew, of course. His family knew and so on, Shepard's family.
That was going to be a question of mine. Now, what happened if Bill Shepard just disappeared? Or what about his family friends? Wouldn't there be like question, well, where did he go? I mean, so a large amount of people, knew about this is what you're saying then. Yeah.
A lot of people knew about this. Now, let's talk about that, because I get asked that question a lot, because basically that was my question. That's why I didn't believe it at first. Like, somebody's going to rat him out,
Right.
So, but essentially, when you take a look at Bill Shepard, his lineage goes back to William Wallace. So if you've ever watched the movie Braveheart with Mel Gibson, Gibson was playing William Wallace. So Bill Shepard is a Scotsman, and he has call it blue blood, for lack of another way to describe it. So he has blue blood. He has a royal lineage going back to William Wallace, the great Scottish warrior and freedom fighter for Scotland. So what you have here is you have a family that is essentially, again, this is my drawing these conclusions based upon reading the book. He has a family that's very much entrenched in this blue blood lineage and these secret societies, especially that of Freemasonry, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. So they're not going to say anything. His close friends and inner circle, they all knew about it. So they weren't going to say anything. In the book, he states that there were people that they did have to pay off in order to be quiet, and they paid them off. He says they didn't have to do that a lot, but there were instances and times when they had to say to people, look, here's some money, go away. Don't say anything. If you say something, bad stuff might happen. Right?
Yeah, that was my next question. Even if you got paid off and you spoke up, Men in Black would track them down, you think? Or something like
he
that?
doesn't say that in the book, but you have to come to a logical conclusion that something bad could happen, because when we think about the magnitude of what it is that's being undertaken here,
it's huge.
It's huge. This is not minor stuff. And when you have Tavistock involved and you have British intelligence involved, you're talking about very, very high-powered organizations and people that have a deep, deep interest in this thing succeeding. Now, the other question I've been asked is, well, what about the McCartney family? How come the McCartney family never said anything? Well, in the book, he states that he met with the McCartneys, and I'm going to run through some dates with you, Derek, which will actually make your eyeballs spin around your head, because it's going to be very, very obvious when I read these dates off that this whole thing was pretty much planned. When he met the McCartneys, brought him into their home, and he went there with Brian Epstein, and it was explained to the McCartney family. Again, this is based upon what Shepard's telling us in the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, that the McCartneys received him with open arms, because this is the way it's being told in the book. You can believe this or not. They wanted their son's legacy to continue. Mm-hmm. And he had come in, he brought his guitar, he was playing a couple of Beatles songs. In fact, he was doing Beatles songs prior to coming into this whole situation with replacing Paul. Way back in the early 1960s, he was doing Mercy Beat albums, and he was known as Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. So think about Sgt. Pepper, and then him also having this alias, Billy Pepper. And when he was Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, he was doing an album, let's say, of 10, 12 songs, 6 of which would be his own songs that he had written, and then the other 6 songs were Lennon and McCartney tunes. So he was doing Beatle cover songs. So that was kind of interesting too. It was almost like he was practicing before this whole thing kind of transpired.
There had to have been a very quick transition between the two.
Yeah, there was a
so
very.
Then he was like preparing.
He was very prepared. So let me just read you something here in the book.
Sure,
He states that his uncle, who was a high-ranking Mason in 1966, called George Martin on September 12, 1966. Now remember, McCartney dies on September 11, 66 in the car crash late at night. On September 12th, George Martin, the producer of the Beatles with EMI Records, Parlophone Records, receives a call from his uncle. He doesn't give his uncle's name, although I'm surmising here, I think there's a clue for us in the song Uncle Albert.
Oh,
okay?
yeah.
Okay. So he calls George Martin on September 12, 1966, and ordered him. He ordered George Martin to have Shepherd replace Paul McCartney. He said that he was selected, Bill Shepherd was selected to replace McCartney because of his long qualifying lineage and musical talent. And the same uncle who ordered George Martin to have Shepherd replace McCartney had also ordered Shepherd as a young man to acquire the talent in anticipation of that day. So I'm not saying anticipation of that day specifically meaning in the replacement of Paul McCartney because McCartney died, but I think what they were doing was they were preparing him to step in to a key moment in time when he could take over. And what I have surmised is that Bill Shepherd as Paul McCartney is a handler. He was a handler. He became a handler of the Beatles. He was the de facto leader of the Beatles starting with 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper. And virtually every Beatles song starting with Pepper right through the release of Let It Be had Paul is Dead clues and hints in it, whether it be backmasked vocals. It was basically, a lot of it was done through wordplay in lyrics, replacing he with she and so on. And
now, why would they do that? Why would they put out clues if they didn't want people to know?
Well, I think what they were doing was, I think it was a lot of tongue in cheek. I think it was a lot of a wink and a nod.
We're getting one over on you.
Yeah, let's see if people pick up on it. I think it was part of the whole Tavistock experiment to see how far they could push the envelope. That's what I think was going on. Plus, and I won't get into it too much here because it's pretty dark, but there was a lot of very dark cult aspects of this that he talks about.
We like dark. We like dark here at WCSB. So,
well, I'll finish up on this whole thing with his uncle for a second. Then we'll go back to the dark aspects of it.
Oh, okay.
When George Martin caught up with Brian Epstein was the Beatles' manager. Epstein, in my view, although it's not stated in the book, was also a very high-ranking Mason. And he had to be. He had to be in order to be a part in this whole play. And I'm going to call it a play because at the end of the day, it's all theater. It's all theater. So when George Martin got the call from his uncle, Shepherd's uncle, and said, hey, my nephew's going to replace Paul McCartney, make sure it happens. George Martin picks up the phone. He goes to call Brian Epstein. And by the time he called Brian Epstein, Epstein had told Martin that Shepherd had already been selected. So word got around pretty quick. In the book, to go into some of the occult stuff, he openly discusses mysticism, including Aleister Crowley, Kenneth Anger, who was the successor to Aleister Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
He gets very deep into the esoteric symbolism, and he also talks about Satanism. The version of Satanism, or how he refers to Satanism in the book, is called Paulism. So it's a cult.
Wow.
It's a cult around the death of Paul McCartney. So in the book, though, he although he disavows Aleister Crowley, he calls it a doctrine of hate. He says he himself is not a Satanist. He explains that he only leveraged Satanism to achieve success. Now, I read that and I thought to myself, that's one of those I want to have my cake and eat it too discussions, right? I'm not a Satanist, but what I did was I leveraged Satanism in order to become extremely wealthy and to have incredible, enormous levels of success. The book, along with anything that has to do with the Beatles, is heavily, heavily into numerology. And although in the book he says he's not caught up in it, he's not caught up in the numbers, he states several times in the book that McCartney is all about the nines and that he's all about the sixes. So the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, is 666 pages to the final period. It has 66 chapters. The book is loaded up with the numbers 3, 6, 11, 33, 66, and 666. These are all occulted numbers. And if we go back to a quote that's attributed to Confucius, Confucius had said that signs and symbols rule the world, not words nor laws. Signs and symbols rule the world, not words nor laws. So when they talk about signs and symbols, numbers are signs and symbols. So he has a very, very deep understanding, and he's very entrenched in the secret societies, into the occult, into mysticism, into Aleister Crowley. I'll explain some of this. I hadn't done this in other shows, but I'll take you through this because you said you like the dark stuff.
Sure.
Some people may not even think this is dark. So let me just run you through some of the things that he says about Freemasonry and the Illuminati in the book. He explains that the G in Freemasonry, everybody always says, what does the G mean in Freemasonry? It means God, geometry, gatekeeper. The 33 degrees of Freemasonry, which most people consider to be the highest level, which it's not, represents the 33 vertebrae of the spine, of the human spine.
Oh, wow.
He states there are 13 degrees above the 33rd degree, known as the degrees of the Illuminati. So when people talk about the Illuminati, and some people like to say, oh, it's nonsense, there's no such thing as the Illuminati. He's telling us in the book that there are 13 degrees above the 33rd degree of Masonry. Those 13 degrees above the 33rd degree is what is referred to as the Illuminati. The 13 degrees correspond to the 13 major parts of the brain. You could see how they do this. Everything has rhyme and reason. Everything is attached to something. And people don't understand this because it's occulted. And occulted only means that it's hidden. That's all it means. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean it's good. It just means occult means hidden. The Masons do much of the Illuminati's networking, and this goes through the Committee of 300. This is one of the very high-ranking organizations within the Pyramid of Power. High-degree Masons receive the secret Luciferian rituals, and there are 20 degrees of rank above the Illuminati that few humans have ever heard of. And he says that Lucifer rules the world. Mm-hmm. So this is all in the book. And so what we see here is that the whole aspect of the Beatles is cloaked and drenched in occultism, in Freemasonry, in mysticism, and in the esoteric schools. And Bill Shepard, who plays the part of Paul McCartney, he is a major player in this structure. Major player.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Just to get people's heads wrapped around this. I haven't really gotten into the Masonic esoteric information in other shows. So this is the first one where I break down what he talks about with regard to the structure of the Masons, of the Illuminati, and what is above the Illuminati. So it's very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and the Lucifer rules the world kind of thing, and the Freemasonry stuff. I know I mentioned to you privately about that band Ghost and how they are using that imagery
Absolutely.
And blatant Satanism kind of to seduce masses at this point. But that's for another talk. And the numbers is pretty fascinating about the spine, the 33. And another number I found pretty interesting is Paul died on 9/11.
Right.
That's just a coincidence, right? Or there's something to that?
Yeah, there's no coincidences. So let me just break down some of the numbers for you. So
okay.
We'll talk about the numbers 11, 33, 66, and 666. So, and I also mentioned 3 because 3 times 11, 3 is a sacred number in the in occult numerology. So 3 times 11 is 33. Anything of multiples of 11 are very powerful numbers. So that's why you'll see 33, 22, 66. You'll see those types of numbers. So multiples of 11 are very powerful numbers. 77, like Flight 77 during 9/11 and so on. But that's a discussion for another show. But when we talk about the numbers, the date of death, September 11th, 1966, if we add the numbers up, 9 plus 1 plus 1, that's 9/11, plus 1 plus 9, the 19 of 1966, plus 6 plus 6. So 9 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 9 plus 6 equals 33. Now, biological Paul's date of birth was June 18th, 1942. Let's take a look at his date of birth. 6 June 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. 9 in occult numerology, it's the inverse of 6. So his date of birth, June, is 6. The date is the 18th. 1 plus 8 is 9. Turn the 9 upside down, it becomes a 6. In 1942, 4 plus 2 is 6. So Paul's date of birth, 6/18/42, is interpreted as 666. That's biological Paul. Now, the date of his death is 9/11/1966, and we've already shown that that date reconciles down to 33. It also reconciles down to 666, and I'll take you through that in a moment too. Now, if we take a look at the number of months that transpired between biological Paul's date of birth, which was June 18th, 1942, to the day he died, September 11th, 1966, it's 290 months. 2 plus 9 plus 0 equals 11. And it was 290 months plus 24 days. The 24 days, 2 plus 4 is 6. So the 290 months, 2 plus 9 plus 0 equals 11. The 24 days, 2 plus 4 is 6. 6 times 11 is 66. So that's one aspect of it. And the whole thing, like I said, it is so tied into the numbers. And the Freemasons and the secret societies, they love that. I tell people they paint by the numbers. So I'll go through the one more number aspect here because I don't want to get people's eyes to glaze over, but this one is very important.
Okay.
The Beatles' first album, released March 22nd, 1963, was Please Please Me. That was the first album with the real Paul McCartney, biological Paul, on it. The release date of March 22nd. March is the third month of the year, the 22nd day. 3 times 22 is 66. Sgt. Pepper was released on June 1st. That's the first album with Bill Shepherd playing the part of Paul McCartney. So that was his debut album. Sgt. Pepper was released on June 1st. So June being the 6th month, on the first day, 6 times 1 is 6. When you attach that to the Please Please Me number of 66, you have 666. So the point I'm trying to make here, again, for the folks, is that a lot of people have a hard time getting their heads wrapped around this aspect of it, Derek, is that numbers play a very, very important part of the planning, of the strategy, and the execution of those in the secret societies. And the secret societies, those are the organizations and institutions that rule. Not your politicians. Your politicians, right? They're in front of the curtain. We're talking about what goes on behind the curtain. Behind the curtain, you have all of these secret societies, of which Freemasonry is front and center.
These numbers, as you said, glazing over. It's first off, it's amazing that you know all this as far as remembering the numbers. But what if they did it on on 724, and couldn't they still pull it off, or is it just like a religion to them that they have to put it together with those numbers?
They can use other dates, and you will see other dates. But September 11th, when you take a look at the September 11th date throughout history, that date, for whatever reason, Derek, and I don't pretend to know the answer to this, it is a recurring date of major events in the history of man. Now, why is September 11th such a powerful date? Why is it used so often? I don't know. But if you go back through time and you take a look at major events, in fact, I don't have the book in front of me, but I have a book in my collection that actually runs through major events that have taken place on September 11th. And it's absolutely mind-boggling. And there's no way, after you take a look at the list of events that took place on that date, September 11th, that anybody can call it coincidence. It's not coincidence. Basically, what they're doing is they're planning events, and September 11th is a major stake in the ground when they plan. Major.
That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. In fact, when you take a look at most things that go on, major events that take place, once you start looking at the numbers and you start adding them up with regard to the dates, times, they like to also play with times. In other words, news articles will be released on the internet, and it'll have a time that will be stamped.
Just like you said, they like to play with times. Couldn't another time suffice? Couldn't another time be? Let's do it at this time. Let's just do it and see what time it happens. Or why do they coordinate it on these dates, these times? Is kind of my question.
Okay, yeah, they coordinate on specific times and dates because these times and dates in the occult, Derek, they have power. They have a purpose. So they believe that through the use of their symbols and their numbers and their signs, that they're able to manifest power. And by manifesting power, they're also manifesting control. And that's why they plan accordingly. So could they use other dates that total to numbers like 11, 33, 66, 666, and so on? Yes, they could. But evidently, and like I said, I'm not so well versed in this that I can speak unequivocally as to why certain dates or certain times are put out there. But when you look at it and you stare at it long enough, the only conclusion you can come to is that these dates and certain times have definite meaning. There's a reason why they're using them. There's a reason why you're using them.
Now, Paul McCartney's his birth date and that added up to the 666. Now, what about Bill Shepard? What's his number?
Well, we don't know. We don't know when Bill Shepard was born, right?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
He only says in the book that he's 5 years older. Now, in the book, he clearly states that he had to stay away from certain information. Like he couldn't talk about his family, specifically names of his family, because if he had written the book, let me just back up a second. He wrote the book, he refers to it as historical fiction, which means that there is absolute truth throughout the book. Historical dates, events, and players and so on are truthful. But he had to weave enough fiction into the book so that he would not be in breach of his confidentiality agreements and his non-disclosures. In order for him to play the part of Paul McCartney, he's under contract. He has confidentiality agreements and non-disclosures in place. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's how he's playing the part. Think of it as this way. His use of the name of Paul McCartney, think of it as it's a corporate fiction. It's a contract.
It's a trademark.
Yes, it's a brand. It's a corporate-based legality. That's what it is. That's who he is. So like when somebody comes to somebody and says, hey, are you the ABC corporation or are you the ABC company? Now, this person, let's just say that they're the sole proprietor of the ABC company, and somebody asks them that question, they're going to say, yes, I am the ABC company. They know that the person is referring to their company or their business. They know that. The person who's answering and saying yes. What they're saying is, yes, that's my corporate entity. That's my business entity. That's my brand. But it's not the flesh and blood person. So when they ask him, when they call him Paul McCartney, or are you Paul McCartney, he's answering from a corporate fiction or straw man perspective. He's saying, yes, I am the corporate entity. I am the business entity known as Sir James Paul McCartney. And they leave it at that. So
do you think people ask him straight to his face these questions?
Yeah. I think people have asked him. There's a dialogue going on between him and David Letterman going back a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And of course, Letterman is in on the whole deal too. Letterman is a very high level. He's a very high level Mason also.
Okay. Yeah. No, I believe you.
No, he is. He's a very high level Mason,
right,
along with Jay Leno and all those guys. So in that interview, he asks McCartney, or he asks Bill Shepard about walking across the street barefooted on the Abbey Road album. And that was supposed to be a clue that Paul McCartney had died and he was replaced by somebody else. Shepard says, yeah, I'm that guy. I'm that guy. So what he's being very coy. So Shepard, what we have to understand about Bill Shepard, he's very smart. He's very intelligent. This guy he's a very worldly person. So he's very good at wordsmithing. He's very good at being evasive, saying something without saying something. So the person sitting in the audience is going to listen to his response during that dialogue with David Letterman, and they're going to say, "Oh, yeah, he's playing along, and it's ridiculous."
Oh, yeah.
Paul McCartney didn't die, but what he's really saying is that all those rumors about the guy that replaced him by a good double, a good lookalike. Yeah, I'm supposedly that guy. I'm that guy.
Good way for him to deflect it.
It's a good way to deflect it, right? And so at the very end of that interview, what happens is there's a sign, a hand gesture that the Masons use. And what they do is they bring their finger to their lips. It's kind of like when people want to say to somebody, be quiet, like hush, they put their finger to their lips. That is a Masonic hand sign, which means we keep our secrets. We divulge no secrets. And Shepard does that at the end of that discussion with David Letterman. And then he smiles a bit, and of course Letterman has this big smirk on his face. So
right, because he's in on it, right?
He's in on it. I also got asked a question about whether people like who worked with Shepard as Paul McCartney, like Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, whether they knew. And my take on it is yes, they knew. Again, this is not in the book, but based upon reading the book and knowing that Jagger and the Stones knew, the Who knew, Elton John knew, Donovan knew. I mean, these guys all knew. There was no way that artists with the stature and the level of success that Michael Jackson had or Stevie Wonder had, that they thought they were going into a studio and thinking that they were playing with Paul McCartney. Because first of all, there's going to be other people there. There's going to be engineers. There's going to be producers. There's going to be friends. So before Michael walks in or Stevie walks in, everybody's calling him Bill. And then as soon as they walk in, what does everybody do? Say, oh, okay, now we got to call him Paul. So I think they all know. They all know. And it's a big club, like George Carlin said, and you ain't in it. It's amazing the level of secrecy that can be kept, Derek. It's so compartmentalized in so many facets of life, so many facets of existence, that it's very hard to believe. I admit it really is. But you can see that it's not so hard to control when the people that control it are all in one big club. Right. And anybody who's not in the club, they have minor roles.
Now, George Carlin, you mentioned him. If this is all true, you kind of find it hard to believe he lasted as long as he did then.
Yeah, I think that what happens is there's a threshold, Derek, where an artist or an entertainer or somebody can push the envelope, and they don't worry about it too much. And the reason why they don't worry about it is because unless you are really riling up the masses, first of all, they refer to us as the profane, which means the unknowing, versus the ruling class, those that are like Bill Shepard. They are what is referred to as adepts or initiates. As long as you're not divulging information which is really, really getting too close to the core, they leave you alone. They might smack you down a little bit here and there once in a while, but that's basically it. And the reason why is because the complexities of the secret societies, the complexities of the esoteric belief systems and mysticism, it is so complicated that nobody can really ever get that close that it's going to mean something. Now, occasionally, somebody does. Somebody gets too close to something.
You got to be on the radar, right?
Who, me?
Yeah.
You know why I'm not on the radar? Because even though I bring a lot of information to my audience and to your audience, the stuff that I'm bringing forward is stuff that's already out there. I mean, I'm getting my information by going to books, by doing deep research and stuff like that, watching documentaries and so on. I'm talking about people, Derek, that, let's just say as an example, are getting too close to maybe some type of, let's say, ritual type of aspect, divulging names that people that are not supposed to be known. It's okay to divulge names of people that are out in the public forum. But if you're going to start spilling the names and identifying people that are in the shadows, that's when you're going to have a big problem. Big problem. So, I'm not doing that type of work. I'm not interested in doing that type of work. First of all, I like life. I enjoy it, I want to be around to do the things. But I also think it's very important to get people to understand that the life that we have, the existence that we have is all carved out for us. That we are being steered and conditioned every which way from Sunday. And some people are more aware of it than others. They're more awake than others. In fact, many people are not aware, and they're just going along with the program. They're essentially running on the hamster wheel. But to the degree that we can figure out that we are on a hamster wheel, we can start asking some more questions, and hopefully we can start making some change for the better, getting humanity pushed in a more positive direction.
Now, do you feel that is obtainable?
I think that we're making some progress. I do think we're making progress. But, there's a part of it, or I should say a part of me that says that I think that this is more of a metaphysical experience than it is a physical experience. That sometimes when I philosophize and I take a step back, I think to myself, perhaps this realm that we're in called Earth, this is exactly the way it's supposed to be. It's not going to change for all intents and purposes. There might be a little nudge here, a little nudge there, make things a little better. Things might get a little worse, whatever it may be. But if we look at Earth as perhaps a school that our soul incarnates into in order to learn lessons, then this is the realm that we're in. We decided to come here to learn certain lessons. So the metaphysical aspect is that we take those lessons with us when we pass away. Our soul takes those lessons, and our soul becomes enriched and becomes further developed by having that experience. So it's my belief that what happens is as the soul becomes more enriched and more developed and more understanding and gains more wisdom, then the soul becomes more enlightened. And as the soul becomes more enlightened, then the next time we incarnate, we have more opportunities open to us in which to explore. So in other words, we may not have to come back to this realm.
What about these guys at the top of the food chain of the bad guys? What are they going to get out of this plane, and what will bad things happen to them because of their role in this?
Well, I think that what happens is that, again, nobody really knows for sure. So I have to take my research and also the work that I do with my spiritual regression work, where I take people into the spirit world and such, that what happens is that some of these souls will have opportunities to turn things around with the next incarnation. So in other words, it's called the law of causality. Every cause has an effect. Every effect has a cause. Other people will refer to it as karma. Now, other souls are corrupted. In other words, they have no intentions of turning things around or making things better. They relish in the darkness. And there are realms in which, after they pass in this life, in which they will reside, that was suitable for the type of spiritual level of unenlightenment that they can exist in until they come back or go someplace else.
Is their goal to bring other people into that camp there, onto the dark side? Like, let's just say, Star Wars. Come to the dark side, Luke.
Yeah, I think so, because that's their ideology. That's their belief system. That's what they believe. So, it's like if you believe something. So if you believe something, then you're going to say, hey, I believe this. You're going to want to bring as many people into that circle as you can because, you think this is a good thing, or this is, where you need to be. This is where you're going to develop. This is where you're going to learn, and so on. But the other thing we have to understand is that when we talk about the people that are involved in bad aspects and evil and stuff like that, think about how long they live for the most part, Derek. They live very long lives. And so when we get down the path of them wanting to prolong their lives through transhumanism, as an example, I want to have my consciousness on a hard drive, on a computer. I want to be able to have my consciousness here in the physical world to live forever, to exist forever. What are they doing when you think about it? What they're really doing is they're avoiding the non-physical realms. They're trying to continue their existence in a physical realm in which they rule and where they're comfortable, in which they know that it's a safe zone, if there is such thing as a safe zone, or say a safer zone, is probably the way I should word it. So it's a very complex, very, very complex area in which to start thinking about and starting to philosophize about. It's very, very, it can really jam your head up. But on the other hand, I think that philosophizing is what humans should be doing more of, because we really should be trying to understand more about what is life about, what is existence all about.
Yeah, how about us getting off topic, huh?
Oh, that's okay. I was going to ask you if you wanted me to go through some of the dates with the swap of Paul McCartney so you can get an understanding of how much Bill Shepard was in the Wings.
Sure.
Okay, let me just take you through that. And so we could swing back to the actual topic here. So as we mentioned, McCartney dies in a car crash very late in the evening on Sunday, September 11th, 1966. As the story goes, and as Bill Shepard explains in the book, he was decapitated. It was a brutal, brutal car crash. He also had a passenger in the car. Her name was Donna. We don't have a last name, but he had a passenger that he had picked up. She was hitchhiking, and so both of them die in that car crash. Now, Brian Epstein meets with Bill Shepard on September 12th. Now, this is the day after, maybe even several hours after, because the car crash took place late in the evening, very late on September 11th. So, and as I mentioned before, Shepard was known as Billy Pepper. He's recording Mercy Beat albums, including Beatle cover songs, and he was known as Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots. Epstein then sends a telegram to Lennon, who was in Paris. Now, the story by some researchers says that McCartney left the studio on September 11th. He was very upset because he had had an argument with Lennon in the studio, but that's not true. Lennon was not in the studio. He was perturbed by a discussion he had with Brian Epstein on September 11th because Epstein was handing out song allocations for the next album, and he had said to Paul, here, you've got to write 5 songs by this date. And evidently, that didn't sit well with McCartney. I'm not thinking because it was 5 songs. It was probably 5 songs within whatever time frame that Epstein had given him. So Anyway, the point being is Lennon wasn't there. Lennon was in Paris. So Epstein sends Lennon a telegram in Paris on September 13th. That's a Tuesday, 1966. Epstein introduces Bill Shepard to John Lennon on September 16th, 1966. That's a Friday. That's 5 days after Paul dies. And this meeting took place in Paris, France. Now, during that meeting, Bill Shepard has a list of demands, as I had mentioned before. And one of those demands was, at the very top of the list, is that he leads the Beatles going forward. That he wanted nothing to do with any more of the love songs that the Beatles were doing predominantly up to that point. So if you go back to the Beatles albums prior to 1966, although not all of the songs were love songs, but many of them were. And Shepard wanted nothing to do with that. He wanted to get away from the love songs, boy meets girl, girl meets boy, boy breaks up with girl, and so on.
Holding hands, yeah.
Yeah, right. He wanted to get into more substantive stuff. So what he really wanted to get into with the advent of Sgt. Pepper, obviously, was the psychedelic era. That's where he was going. So Lennon agrees to relinquish control of the Beatles under duress. He was very, very upset about his childhood friend Paul McCartney passing away. Bill Shepard then becomes the new leader of the Beatles, and then Sgt. Pepper becomes Shepard's debut album. Now, here's an interesting footnote that is not mentioned in the book, but is mentioned by other researchers. And in fact, I have a recording of Mal Evans, who was a Beatle quote-unquote manager, but he really was a Beatle handler. He was a handler working to actually steer the Beatles. Mal Evans is said to have co-wrote the song, the title track of the Sgt. Pepper album, Sgt. Pepper, and also the song Fixing a Hole. And that Bill Shepard, as Paul McCartney, had promised Mal Evans co-writing credits, if you will, of those songs, which never happened. And of course, Mal Evans passes away in the 1970s under very, very suspicious circumstances. And it was rumored at the time that in the early 1970s that Mal Evans was carrying along a tell-all manuscript about the Beatles. So he was shot and killed by a policeman. I'm trying to remember the story, but evidently he had supposedly had a bout of violent aggressiveness, craziness, which, by the way, many people said was not Mal Evans' disposition. So that whole story was kind of odd to many people that knew him, and that he was shot and killed by a policeman, and that put an end to Mal Evans' life. Then the question comes up, which many people ask, like, how was it done? How was the transformation made? Now, we talked about the occultism before and the fact that he's very much into the occult and into mysticism and into the esoteric. And I mentioned that he referred to Paulism, which is based on Satanism. Bill Shepard believes that Paul McCartney is speaking through him and operating through him through the great beyond. He believes that there's a possession in place, that Bill Shepard contains two beings, if you will. He contains himself, Bill Shepard, and he also encompasses the spirit of biological Paul McCartney. And he utilizes and leverages his mysticism and understanding of his esoteric teachings in order to manifest this coming together of him and biological Paul McCartney. He had extensive plastic surgery and fillers, and people sometimes interpret that when I talk about this as a nip and a tuck or facelift. No, it was not. Think in terms of reconstructive surgery. He also mentions in the book that there were other people that played Paul McCartney that paged in and out. So many times when you look on the internet and you take a look at Paul McCartney and you take a look at pictures of him over time, you're going to see very different looking people. And I put a slide together on this. Very, very different looking people. Why is that? Because along with Bill Shepherd, who has a permanent contract, that's what he will say. There were other Paul McCartneys, people playing Paul, but he's the only one with a long-term permanent contract. And so these other Pauls, it's my supposition, paged in and out when the surgeries were at a point where maybe he couldn't make a public appearance. So somebody else would make a cameo. Somebody else would be seen in public. Somebody else would be photographed in a magazine who looked a lot like Paul McCartney but wasn't Shepherd. He was tutored by Brian Epstein. This is how you know Epstein was in on the whole gig, and a Mason. Brian Epstein had tutored Bill Shepherd on many of biological Paul's mannerisms and quirks. He had to master Paul McCartney's arching of his eyebrow. He's naturally right-handed and had to learn to play left-handed.
Oh, wow.
And that almost didn't come to fruition. And in fact, he says that he was able to master playing left-handed by essentially summoning Paul McCartney to come forth and to help him with left-handed playing. Now, some people are just going to be going nuts over that and just rolling their eyes. I'm just telling you what's in the book, and I'm telling you that this guy is deep into the occult. And if you do research into the occult, deep research into the occult, this is what they do. They summon unseen forces, okay? So I'm not putting this out of the realm of possibility. The thing is, now what happened was once he had the surgeries and the fillers, and, he was known as the man of 1,000 voices. Bill Shepherd was a very seasoned session musician. And one of the things that he was asked to do many times was to mimic other singers. And he was very good at mimicking other singers. And this is how he was able to get his voice to sound very similar to Paul McCartney. He's not an exact match. But what happened over time, Derek, is that people see what they want to see. So what was happening was presentation is everything. He was pictured with the Beatles as Paul McCartney, therefore he's Paul McCartney. And when you take a look at Sgt. Pepper, the Sgt. Pepper album, and all of their beards, their mustaches, the whole presentation of the Beatles was completely different from anything the audience or the public had seen prior. So if you think of, let's say, Revolver as an example, or Rubber Soul, and you take a look at what the Beatles looked like then with their mop tops, and then you look at Sgt. Pepper, there was an amazing stark contrast difference in how they were being presented.
Well, was it that same time they decided they didn't want to play out live anymore?
Right, exactly. So Brian Epstein comes out and says that the Beatles are no longer going to play live. And one of the reasons why they did that was because Bill was still working on, my belief is that he was still working on his left-handed bass guitar playing, which, by the way, in the book he says on recordings, when he records, he still plays right-handed. Okay? Left-handed is his public persona. When he plays music in the studio, he's playing right-handed. Epstein had come out and said the Beatles are no longer going to play live. And the reason for that was because, and even Shepherd playing Paul McCartney had come out in an interview around that same time frame in 1967 and said that the reason why is because, well, we just can't be creative enough, because when we're doing touring and we're in front of all these audiences and we can't hear ourselves anymore, we're stagnant, we're static, we can't be creative, we can't be imaginative, and we can't put out the type of music that we want to put out. That was the cover story. But the real reason was because Shepherd was much taller than Paul McCartney. He was still trying to get himself to be very, very more adept at playing left-handed. And quite honestly, people would have seen the difference. I mean, they would have seen this tall guy playing bass, and they would have said, well, what happened to the shorter guy? Right. Would he have a growth spurt? So a lot of that was what was going on. So very, very interesting. Also, I know we're running out of time here. He also played the character of Vivian Stanshall. of the Doodah Band. So people can go on to onto YouTube and onto Google, and they can look up Vivian Stanshall, and they can take a look and see that. Also, you can see a transition of Vivian Stanshall before the injections and the plastic surgeries took place. Even he changed drastically in his appearance. And also, if you go to some of my other interviews, I have a slideshow in there, and you can see where I transitioned from Phil Ackrell, which Bill Shepherd played in the early 1960s with Denny Laine, as I'd mentioned, to Vivian Stanshall, to ultimately Paul McCartney. So Paul McCartney, at the end of the day, is a character that he plays, plain and simple. And the book is The Memoirs of Billy Shears. It's written by the author Tom Hugh Harriet, who is essentially a ghostwriter for the person who's actually telling the story. And the reason why he's telling the story, Derek, he says in the book, is because he's old now. Bill Shepherd is 80 years old now. He's 80 years old. And he's, quite honestly, he's at a runway.
He just played here in Cleveland, too, 2 nights, sold out.
And everybody knows the songs as Paul McCartney songs. And if you have been playing the guy for 50 years and you wrote all the songs that this guy wrote for 50 years, I mean, there's a part of you that says, I wrote these songs. Bill Shepherd wrote these songs. Paul McCartney's dead. He's been dead since 1966. I'm the guy writing these songs. So what he's doing now is he's putting it out there in a way that it's camouflage. There's no doubt about it. It's a very soft way of putting it out there, but he's floating it out. So if you read the book, I highly recommend it to anybody who's into this topic. If you're not into this topic, then 666 pages is going to be extremely overwhelming. But if you're into this theory and this conspiracy, the book is a great read and well worth your time. Well,
on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. I just started thinking about Linda McCartney and how she plays into this, but we're just not going to have time to talk about that.
Yeah, she knew he wasn't Paul McCartney. So did Heather Mills.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mike, hey, thanks for calling in and discussing this with us and doing some enlightening. I mean, it gives me a lot to think about. And hopefully my listeners are now like pondering a little bit of what you said.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's an extraordinary story, and it's hard to get your head wrapped around. But, once you read that book, Derek, a lot of questions get answered. And I want to thank you again for having me on. It's always a lot of fun.
Well, we're going to do it again. I want to talk chemtrails in the future.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk about that.
Okay, awesome. All right, man. Thank you very much. I'll see you, Mike.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
When I get